Welcome to this talk, which has the research question, can a nuclear war happen today? I'm here with Fred Kaplan, who is going to talk about this question. Since the late 70s, he's been following the US policy on warfare, and especially nuclear weapons, from the inside as a defense advisor to Les Aspin in the House of Representatives for 2 years. And from the outside, he has followed it as an author and a journalist. His first book, The Wizards of Armageddon from 1983, told the inside story of nuclear strategy. Since then, he has written another 5 books, which all to some extent deal with the decision-making connected to military and defense strategy. And his latest book, The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War, was published earlier this year. Fred has also worked as a journalist for many years, both in the US and the Moscow office for the Boston Globe. And these days he writes a column for Slate. This is an event by Nei til atomvåpen and ICAN Norge. My name is Andrea Rogenstrand. I'm a journalist with the Norwegian magazine that writes about defense and defense policy, Forsvarets Forum. Fred, can you start off?
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to this. It's a great pleasure to be almost there, talking with you. For many years, and very few people would deny this, the whole concept of nuclear weapons, nuclear war, I mean, it seems insane. But to really understand the subject, you have to understand that there is a logic to this. It's not just that the people doing this are crazy or evil. There's a logic. The logic has some bizarre premises, but it's useful to understand the logic so that if you do want to get into debates or activism or whatever about reducing or eliminating them, you at least know where the people advocating them are coming from. So where this all began was toward the end of World War II, in the spring of 1945, the head of the Army Air Forces asked General Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the 21st Bomber Command, firebombing all of Japan, when will the war be over? Germany had already surrendered, Japanese were still fighting, when will the war be over? And LeMay said, took the problem to his staff and they came back and he said, the war will be over by September 1st, because by that time, we will have bombed every square mile of Japan. So that was his notion of warfare, from the air, bombing everything. Now, a couple months later, the atom bomb ended the war. And this confirmed in LeMay's idea that this is what war in the modern age is about. And shortly after the war, he was made the commander of Strategic Air Command, which had control over the bombers that would drop the bomb. He wouldn't make decisions about whether to, but he devised the war plans, he trained the crews and so forth. So by the end of the decade, the end of the 1950s, the United States had a policy called massive retaliation. And this is how massive it was. The war plan, approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and President Dwight Eisenhower said this: if the Soviet Union occupied West Berlin or invaded Western Europe, at the time the United States didn't have much in the way of conventional defenses, so the plan was to retaliate, and not if the Soviet Union used nuclear weapons, just as if they invaded on land, Western Europe, say. The plan was to fire off our entire atomic arsenal against every target in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China, even if China did not have anything directly to do with the war. as quickly as possible. And the estimate was that this would kill about 285 million people, probably not including the effects of radioactive fallout throughout Western Europe, throughout our allied countries. Now, Eisenhower, who was president, he wasn't a bloodthirsty man. LeMay arguably was. Eisenhower wasn't. But his view was that, look, if there's a war between the United States and Russia, and it was widely thought there might be, it will go nuclear very quickly. And so we have to prevent this from happening. And the way you prevent this is to promise that we will unleash the most cataclysmic damage on the Soviet Union as possible. It was a deterrent. But then something happened. In the early 60s, the Soviet Union started developing its own long-range nuclear arsenal. And so the massive retaliation strategy had a sort of flaw. If Russia invaded Western Europe, West Germany, or occupied Berlin or whatever, and we responded by nuking Russia, Russia had its own weapons. They could respond by nuking us. So they might think that their nuclear force will deter us from doing anything in response to their conventional aggression. And so strategists started to think about two things. One, building some kind of conventional defense in Europe, which we eventually did, although it took quite a long time and was very expensive. The other was coming up with some plans for what might be called limited nuclear war. For example, if the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe, maybe we would launch just some of our weapons against, say, the rest of their missiles. And then say, if you respond to this, then we will unleash the rest of our weapons and destroy your populations. So over the whole decade of the 1960s, there was this pursuit of limited options. And when Kennedy was president, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, came up, he planned a list of 5 separate nuclear options for different ways of responding to, launching everything but not hitting any of their cities, kind of escalation into trying to control the damage if at all possible and control the escalation. By the time Richard Nixon became president in 1969, he discovered that the plan remained the same, because what had happened was that when the military took McNamara's guidance to Strategic Air Command, there was always kind of a caveat. When it talked about limited options, they would say, to the extent possible, or to the extent that it's consistent with military objectives. And then they would determine that it wasn't feasible and it wasn't consistent with military objectives. So really all through the 1960s and 70s, we still had this policy of massive retaliation. It started calming down, not calming down, but I mean, options were put into place somewhat in the 70s. But then what happened, and I'm, by the way, I'm going through the history very quickly, very abbreviated fashion. We can look at certain details later. I'm just noting a trend. By the 1980s, so George H.W. Bush was president, and there was a civil servant in the Pentagon whose name was Frank Miller. And before he went to the Pentagon, he was involved in nuclear policy. He'd read all of these documents by McNamara and the Nixon administration talking about limited options and restraint and withholding certain weapons and not attacking certain targets. And he was briefed on the nuclear war plan, which was called the SIOP, Single Integrated Operational Plan, along with the Secretary of Defense. And he noticed that there was no talk in the briefing about any of these limited options. It was still all blow up everything. And so the Secretary of Defense, who by the way was Dick Cheney at the time, gave Miller the authority to go into SAC and to look very deeply into the entire war plan. What weapons were aimed at what targets, how many of them, what were the assumptions? And he came up with some surprising results. Nobody had really done this before. No civilian had done this before. He found, I mean, we know the term overkill. I mean, overkill is an understatement with what was going on. For example, he discovered that in the 50-mile radius around Moscow, there were 700 nuclear weapons aimed at various targets, most of them in the megaton range. There was an air base in the Arctic Circle. And this wasn't even a primary air base. It was a base where Russian bombers would return after bombing American cities. And he discovered that there were 17 nuclear weapons aimed at this air base. There was an anti-ballistic missile site in Moscow, which after the Cold War, we discovered was completely useless. There were 68 nuclear weapons aimed at this ABM site. I mean, it went, say, for example, on the list, it said, okay, one of the objectives is to destroy the Russian tank army. Okay, not only were nuclear weapons aimed at the divisions that had tanks, they were also aimed at the factories that made the tanks. They were at the factories that made the metal that was rolled into tanks, at the mines where I mean, it was everything. And at this point, George H.W. Bush was involved in some nuclear arms control talks, arms reduction talks with Russia. And Miller asked one of the colonels that he was dealing with at Strategic Air Command, what would happen if we reduced the number of our weapons down to this amount? Would you still be able to carry out your objectives, to carry out your war plan? And the guy said, well, we don't really ask questions like that. And he said, well, maybe you don't understand. He goes, no, I completely understand what you're saying, but that's not the way it works. What we do, we take the number of weapons that we have and we apply them to our targets on the list. And this was just stunning, because what it meant was that at no point anywhere had anybody been asking how many weapons are enough. I mean, they did in Washington, but they didn't ask it in a way that it could be understood as an operational question at Strategic Air Command. In Strategic Air Command, it was a strictly mechanical exercise. At one point, there was a hearing in the 1980s where the commander of Strategic Air Command told Congress, I need 10,000 weapons because I have 10,000 targets. Now, nobody really took this seriously. They thought maybe he was joking, maybe he was kind of stupid, but in fact, that was how it was done. It was a purely mechanical thing. And there were so many weapons applied to so many targets because they had a list of, there was something called the National Strategic Target List, which was just things we might want to destroy in a war because it has something to do with the economic vitality or military capability of the enemy. And then there were the weapons, and they just mechanically applied these weapons to those targets. Well, that changed after a while. And in fact, with no nuclear arms control agreements at all, after Miller, on the authority of the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they went back and redid the war plan, really asking, what do you really need? And they reduced the number of nuclear weapons at the time from about 12,000 to about a little under 6,000. And the arms control agreement that was signed with the Russians, in fact, limited it at the time to 6,000. And the military signed on to it without much trouble because they had been through this exercise and they realized that things had been absolutely insane for decades, and this was plenty. Now, a little bit later, under the Obama administration, and this hadn't been really written about until my book, there was a very similar exercise where for months, civilian and military officials sat around in a room in the White House going over every single target on the list, every single weapon. Do we need to hit this target at all? If we do, does it really need to be with 2 weapons? Would 1 weapon be enough? And so forth. And at the time, well, there were counting rules. Depending on you counted, we had about 1,500 at that time. It was really more like 2,300, but in terms of arms control agreements and the way bombers are counted, it was 1,500. Strategic Air Command agreed that without any harm to national security, this could be cut to 1,000. But they said, we will not endorse this unless the Russians also agree to cut their weapons by 1/3. Now, and by this time, the Russians had annexed Crimea and made incursions in eastern Ukraine. So this wasn't going to happen. But, you know, by a purely rational basis, you could say, you know, as long as we're able to do what is needed to deter the Russians from attacking us, it doesn't really matter how many weapons the Russians have. It's not like tanks versus tanks on a battlefield. And if they have more, they might break through. No, this is weapons of a cataclysmic sort of nature. It shouldn't matter. In fact, you know, China, their view all along, they have about 300 nuclear weapons. Their view is we need just enough to deter Russia and the United States from attacking us. And, you know, it seems to have done a pretty good job. There was a point in the mid-60s when China had maybe a dozen nuclear weapons. Russia was thinking about attacking them along the Yalu River and decided not to because they had a dozen nuclear weapons. So now they have a few hundred. We have a few thousand. Russia has a few thousand. Israel has about, it's not quite known, but probably around 200. A lot of countries have nuclear weapons for the purpose, mainly, of deterring their enemy from attacking them. You don't need North Korea, maybe a dozen, maybe 60, nobody quite knows. That's all they've got. They genuinely fear that they would be attacked if they didn't have these nuclear weapons. A dozen seems to be about enough. So over time, all these elaborate scenarios have been under, you know, this whole concern about that we need some limited options over time became, you know, something ridiculously abstract, where, you know, elaborate scenarios, which are completely mythic. I mean, the point of fact is this: nobody really knows what happens if one side launches a half dozen nuclear weapons. And let's say they don't aim them at cities, they aim them at military targets. Some of them are around cities, though. What happens after that? You know, there might be this dream that each side will play this, what's called a tit for tat game. We fire 6 weapons, they fire 6 weapons back. The presidents are sitting like it's a chessboard, plotting their next move, 3 moves ahead. Well, the fact is, you know, communications could go out. The chess players might not even know what's going on. There might not be immediate information about how many weapons they used and how many sites of ours have been destroyed. Things could get out of control very quickly. And then, of course, there's the issue of nuclear winter, which was really only, it's been talked about now for 30 years, but it has not been worked into any of the war plans. By some calculations, exploding 80 fair-sized nuclear bombs anywhere on Earth could set into motion nuclear winter, which could destroy most life on the planet. Well, most limited nuclear war plans envision the use of at least 80 nuclear weapons. So it could well be that there is no, even if you accept all of the premises and all of the assumptions in all these scenarios, there might in fact not be any such thing as a limited nuclear war. I'll just say one more thing and then we'll get into the discussion. Most presidents, when they have faced a crisis in which the use of nuclear weapons has been contemplated, and this has happened more often than many people think, most of these presidents dig very deeply into the logic of all this. They immerse themselves in it. And they understand that there is no good way out of it. And they scramble out of the rabbit hole as quickly as possible and come to a diplomatic solution. The fear that many of us here, and I assume there as well, have about our current president, Donald Trump, is that it's known that he does not immerse himself into anything. He hasn't spent 10 minutes looking into the question of nuclear weapons. I think we have learned that he is not eager to get into a war, but he could easily get pulled into one by his own ignorance about what one step might lead to another step. So I guess the topic, the title of this topic is something like, is nuclear war possible today? Yeah, you know, because these nuclear weapons exist and about 9 countries have them. I think, you know, why haven't any nuclear weapons been used since 1945? I mean, it's a good question. I think part of it is the thing of nuclear deterrence. If you think that if you get involved in a war, you might get clobbered with nuclear weapons, it makes you think twice. It has an effect. It is something real. On the other hand, a lot of it is just pure luck. There have been times when there have been false warnings of a nuclear attack and nobody's done anything about it because it just doesn't quite seem credible. There's no crisis going on. Why would this be happening? It must be a mistake. You know, the real fear is what happens if there is an accident, a misunderstanding, a miscalculation at a time when there is a crisis going on. And then the mistake might be fallen into. So on that discouraging note, we'll get into some discussion of this.
Thank you, Fred. And it's so interesting to hear the historic timeline of how different governments have dealt with this. Could you talk a bit about why it's interesting today? In your book, you write about Donald Trump and North Korea and how Twitter is suddenly a part of the discussion here.
Yeah, it's crazy. But you mean to talk about the possibility with North Korea, for example? Or?
Yeah, or I guess as we write in the introduction to this talk, nuclear war is kind of on the agenda again, which for many people has not been
Right.
something on the forefront of their minds for years.
Yeah. There has been, you know, underneath the political reality, all of this talk and scenario that's been going on kind of underground. You know, the people who spend every day, every hour of their working days thinking about this stuff and planning it and rehearsing it and training for it and planning and so forth. There's a great continuity through all this period. What happened with North Korea, and by the way, I should have noted at the beginning, all along, at least in US war plans, there have been first strike options. You know, the idea that not waiting for the other side to nuke us, but to respond or threaten to respond to conventional aggression with nuclear weapons. What was different about what happened with the Trump administration is that Kim Jong-un in 2017 was testing a lot of missiles and a lot of nuclear weapons, and he was on the verge of testing a long-range missile, one that could, if a nuclear weapon was attached, could hit the west coast of the United States. And Trump said, if you keep launching these tests and issuing your rhetoric, you know, we will rain fire and fury on you like the world has never seen. Now, he wasn't threatening to nuke North Korea if they attacked us. That's kind of always been policy. He was saying, if you develop the capability to attack us, we will attack you, which is, it's not even preemptive war, it's something called preventive war. And that's something different. And one thing I go into in my book is that this wasn't just rhetoric. He had the Pentagon devise plans then in which we would start not using nuclear weapons right away, but it was very clear that it could escalate to that, but that we would start taking offensive action against North Korea if they tested an intercontinental ballistic missile. And there were some instances when North Korea, about 5 instances, when North Korea was on the verge of testing a missile, and there was a conference call with several 4-star generals, commanders, Secretary of Defense, just as there would be in a warning of a nuclear attack, to monitor the situation and decide what to do if it seemed like it was an ICBM. It was noted that there are these US weapons in South Korea called advanced tactical missiles. They're ballistic missiles, they're conventionally armed. The Secretary of Defense was given advance authority, if he thought it was necessary, to fire a couple of these conventional, non-nuclear ballistic missiles at the missile test site in North Korea, with the possibility of killing some officials as well. Kim Jong-un, it was known, liked to go to some of these tests. So he had the authority to do this on his own recognizance. It never happened, but I mean, you know, we came closer to getting into some kind of shooting war with North Korea, much closer than is generally believed.
So in most conflicts, there's a form of escalation. You might see some public revolt or 2 countries launching more and more concrete attacks on each other. In your research, have you seen how the different presidents or different governments have assessed the escalation phase? What would it take to start a nuclear war?
Well, you know, there's been a lot of books written about this, theoretical books. There was a guy named Herman Kahn in the early 60s who wrote a book called On Escalation, where he described 35 rungs of escalation leading up to nuclear war. But, you know, this is kind of fantasy. Luckily, we haven't got into a situation where we've climbed even 2 or 3 of these. Cuban Missile Crisis came very close. There was also the Berlin crisis. Now, this has been largely forgotten, but in 1961, the year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev told Kennedy that, you know, remember at the time, West Berlin, which was a Western protectorate, was inside East Germany, 100 miles inside East Germany. Now, of course, it's unified and there is no West and East Germany, but back then it was a very big thing. And Khrushchev said, I'm going to take over West Berlin. It's part of East Germany. And if you try to stop me, there will be war. And again, to stop him with conventional weapons, we would have had to invade East Germany and go 100 miles. Didn't have the ability to do that then. So within the Kennedy administration, and now there are a lot of declassified documents about this, there was serious talk, and they talked about escalation. What do we do if Khrushchev actually carries this out? And they worked up 4 phases. Phase 1 would be, well, we send in a company of troops. Phase 2, we send in a battalion. Phase 3, we, you know, start harassing them with planes, blockading, UN resolutions. And then phase 4 was nuclear. And there was phase 4A, which was we just launch one nuclear weapon. Doesn't matter where, it could be in the middle of the ocean, but it's to show them that we're serious and they'd better back off. 4B was using what were called tactical nuclear weapons. We had thousands of them at the time that would destroy their troops on the battlefield. And then 4C was general war, which was that plan I laid out at the beginning of my talk, unleashing all of our nuclear weapons against all of the targets. And there was big discussions, I mean, with Kennedy in the room, like, would it be possible to do 4A without it automatically escalating to 4C? And one person said, well, I think we should do 4C right away, because if we did 4A, the Russians would attack us and we might lose. Whereas if we did 4C right away, we could win. I mean, these were serious people. This was like the commander of NATO and a deputy secretary of defense. I mean, this is what they're, and Kennedy realized this is going to end in disaster. And he decided to do something interesting, which was at the time, before Kennedy was the president, it was believed that there was a missile gap. Russians had way, 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 way more missiles than we did. And then we put photo reconnaissance satellites in the air. And by the time Kennedy became president, it was clear that, yeah, there was a missile gap, but we were way ahead of the Russians. But the Russians didn't know that we knew. And so they continued to bluff. And so Kennedy had a high Pentagon official give a speech, basically saying, we know there is no missile gap. Here's how many missiles we have. Here's how many missiles you have. Even if you attack us first, we'll be way ahead of. Anyway, he got the Russians to back down in that way. But Khrushchev, who thought that we were planning a first strike, was terrified. He realized that we knew that he had nothing to respond. And so he decided as an interim step to put medium range missiles in Cuba, because that would give him an ability to attack the United States if we attacked them. And that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So on the one hand, Kennedy thwarted, put an end to what he saw as inevitable escalation, leading to nuclear war, leading to disaster. But in the process of doing it, set in motion another crisis, which he also ended. But still, the point is, once you get into this stuff, people know way, way less than what all these very tidy war games that you can play in a cellar someplace would indicate. You don't really know what the other person is thinking. They don't know what you're thinking. You don't know what their thresholds are. They don't know what our thresholds are. And you, more to the point, you don't really know what effect setting off a half dozen nuclear weapons in another country are going to be. It's not necessarily the case that the head of that country will say, it's only a half dozen nuclear weapons and they were all just in the kiloton range and they've only killed 50,000 people, not 1 million people. So I'm going to be very restrained in my response. That's people don't stay rational, if that is rational. Things can get out of hand very, very quickly. And again, most presidents who find themselves in these crises have realized this and try to get out of it as soon as possible.
It's very interesting hearing you talking about how different people have influenced or approached the topic in different ways. As you described the meeting with Kennedy and the military leaders, where there are a number of different approaches, from just going all in to trying to avoid this as much as possible. Could you talk a bit about how a single person or a single leader can influence or the use of nuclear weapons?
Well, let me continue with Kennedy because it's very enlightening. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, which most of you know something about, but there's some great misunderstandings about here. So the Russians bring missiles into Cuba, we spot them. There's a big standoff that lasts for 13 days. We're demanding that Khrushchev take the missiles out. How it really ended was that on the last day, Khrushchev sends a message saying, we will remove our missiles from Cuba if you take your missiles out of Turkey. We had about 15 missiles in Turkey at the time, which were very similar to the missiles in Cuba, and were just as close to Russia as those missiles were to the United States. Immediately, Kennedy thought this was a great idea. Seems like a fair trade. Everybody around the table, not just the military, but his smart civilian advisors too, were vociferously against this trade. There are tapes of this. Kennedy secretly tape recorded all of the meetings. You can order them from the Kennedy Library. Listen to them yourself. There are transcripts. And everybody in the room was saying, this will be a disaster. NATO will be destroyed. The Turks will feel betrayed. We will look weak. And Kennedy just keeps coming back to, look, I'm thinking on Monday, it was scheduled on Monday, we were going to start bombing the missile sites in Cuba with conventional weapons. 5 days later, we were scheduled to have an invasion of Cuba. One thing that we didn't know until later was that some of the missiles in Cuba were already armed with nuclear warheads. We also didn't know till much later that the Russians were hiding 40,000 troops on the island of Cuba, anticipating a possible American invasion. In other words, so Kennedy took the deal, but he told 7 people, don't tell anybody else that this is happening. This is a complete secret. And it wasn't revealed until 25 years later. But the point is, if anybody else but Kennedy had been president, any of these smart guys sitting around the table, and they were all guys, by the way, there were no women in office, but if any of them had been president, we almost certainly would have gotten into a war with the Soviet Union. So, there's the big example. Yeah, you can often say, well, this guy who's president might be kind of an idiot, but he has smart people around him. Well, it's the president who makes the decision. And as we discovered later, Kennedy turned out to be smarter than any of the other people in the room. So it's especially in the United States, where the president has the sole power to launch nuclear weapons. He can do it with nobody's permission. It's very important who's president. Less in European countries where there's a prime minister and a wider government and so forth, maybe less so. And you can be thrown out with 1 vote of confidence. No, I'm afraid that the country that one of the 2 superpowers with thousands of nuclear weapons, so much hinges on one person.
So when there's a political or military leader will sit in their chair and they will maybe get a message that we have detected that there's missiles coming towards us. Mm-hmm. How long time do you estimate they would have to make a decision on their move?
Well, I mean, if it's coming from Russia, it's about half an hour, which is one reason why I think, and many other people think, it would be a good idea to get rid of the land-based missiles altogether, because those are the targets that you have to worry about. The submarines, they're under the surface of the ocean, they can't be targeted. The bombers, on warning, they can take off, and they don't have to drop their weapons. They can circle at a point before doing so. The missiles, it really is a use them or lose them situation, as they say. Few people think that in any case a war would start just out of the blue like that. It would be preceded by a lot of tensions and moves and counter moves. There is a procedure, there's a protocol. If the president is thinking about using nuclear weapons, there is like a bunch of people that he consults, if there's time. Yeah, if it is just a missile attack, there's no time. But there's a procedure where he talks with the commander of strategic command and the secretary of defense and the chairman of the joint chiefs of staff. But basically, the decision's up to him. He's supposed to restrict his moves to legal military action, but what does that mean? If there is a nuclear option that he's picking, and there are lots of nuclear options now, if it's in the book, that means it's already been vetted by military lawyers. It's there. So how does a president do this? It's not like there's a button. And there are movies where he's pushing a button, or like he puts his palm on a thing and that. No. There is an officer who's with him all the time carrying around a very heavy case. It's called the football. That's just a book. And it's a book with all the options that he can pick. And there's something where he basically communicates with a one-star general in the National Military Command Center, which is in the Pentagon. And there's something that he does that authenticates that it really is him. And then he picks an option. I want, option 43A or whatever. And then that one-star general communicates the order to the missile sites and to the submarines and the bomber bases. And that's it. It doesn't go through the Secretary of Defense. It doesn't go through the Commander of Strategic Command. If all that happens, and by the way, people who are in these positions, the one-star general at the command center and so forth, they're kind of picked for their inclination toward obedience. So unless somebody decides to get incredibly insubordinate and says, no, I'm not going to do this, it happens almost automatically. And the people who are in it, they're down in a submarine, they're down in a missile silo, they're in the basement of the Pentagon. They don't necessarily know what's going on up there. As far as they know, the Russians have attacked us. They don't know. Their job is to do what the commander-in-chief has ordered. Now, luckily we have never even got close to that. But two things are worth noting. There have been a few incidents where, as I said earlier, there have been false radar. Due to a computer problem or something, it looks like a bunch of missiles are coming our way. And by the way, it's been true in Russia too. And somebody up high, but kind of on a middle level, has said, no, I don't believe this is really happening. I'm not going to pass it on up, which is pretty ballsy. And there have been cases where, well, I'll just leave it at that. There have been cases where it looks like a war is about to happen and somebody in a position has overstepped his authority and decided, no, I'm not going to send this message up the link because I don't think it's really happening. So, that's kind of what I said earlier, that we've been saved in some part by luck.
So if a nuclear war was to break out today, does anyone have any conception of what that would look like? It's 75 years since it was last used.
Well, yeah, there have been models of the kind of damage that would be done, but here's the interesting thing. A nuclear weapon, it has several effects. There's blast, like a regular bomb, although much, much bigger. There's heat, there's prompt radiation, there's radioactive fallout, there's possibly nuclear winter. In the war plans and in all the games that are played about how much damage would be done, really only the blast effects are taken into account, because those can be very precisely measured, because there's a lot of data from bombs in, say, World War II even, that you can just scale up. And it's quite exact. Things like heat, radiation, fallout, nuclear winter, it's hard to calculate. It depends on a lot of things, which way the wind is blowing, what season of the year it is, whether it's day or night. And so in a lot of these calculations, they don't calculate it at all. Even though heat and radiation might have even wider effects, that is covering a wider territory, and fire and smoke, even more effects than bombs. So even if you accept all the premises of what these people are doing, they're severely underestimating the actual effects of these weapons. Now, in terms of the effects on society, many years ago when I was a kid, we used to have, there were fallout shelters, and there were drills in schools where you'd like get into your desk and go like this. Even when I was a kid, I have to say, almost nobody took these things seriously. But there were procedures, at least right now, and actually I don't know what the situation is in Norway. There are no more fallout shelter drills or evacuations or anything. I think there'd be total panic. I think even a couple of nuclear bombs going off. I mean, look what happens. Something like just an airplane going into a skyscraper has happened to my city in New York, or a bomb in Beirut, or whatever. We're talking about a nuclear, the bombs that go off that you see like going off in Iraq or places like this, these are at most 2,000 pounds of blast. That's 1 ton. The smallest weapons that we have in the US nuclear arsenal are 8 kilotons, 8,000 tons. So 8,000 times just the blast. The stuff that's in our long range nuclear weapons, the missiles, the bomber, those are in hundreds of kilotons, hundreds of thousands of tons, hundreds of thousands of times more powerful blast than the bombs that you see going off, destroying a building in Iraq or something like that. So picture just one of those combined with the heat and the fire and the smoke and the fallout and the disruption of communications, because things like heat and fallout can destroy communications lines. So you don't even know what's going on at other places. Nobody has really seriously gamed the effects of what would happen. And in terms of escalation, there would be a lot of pressure. People saying to the president, Mr. President, if you wait and ride out this attack, I have no guarantee that we'll even be able to use any of these weapons because the communications links might go out. We have to launch these things now, if at all. And, maybe he would use it, maybe he wouldn't. Some people have asked the question, our entire policy rests, it's deterrence. We'll bomb you if you bomb us. Let's say they bomb us. And nobody discusses this because it's dangerous to discuss, but would we really fire back? If they've killed New York, does it really matter if we kill Moscow? But see, you can't even talk about that because one element of deterrence is that if you're threatening to do something in response to what the bad guys do, the bad guys have to believe that you would really do it. And therefore, you kind of have to convince yourself that you would really do it, which means you have to build the certain kinds of weapons and develop the kind of war plans that would allow you to do it. And so this is something very interesting that's happened over the decades, given this notion of credible deterrence. At some point, a plan for deterrence converges, the concept of deterrence converges with the concept of nuclear warfighting. They become almost indistinguishable. And so if you get into that frame of mind, and if you want to understand the frame of mind of people to make decisions about this, they're going into steps 3, 4, and 5 of what they need to do to fight a nuclear war. And they're arguing that we need to do that for the sake of credible deterrence. Now, I think ordinary people, including most presidents, don't really think that way. and that deterrence is much more powerful with very simple things. But that is how you get trapped into this logic where, in the name of deterrence, you develop all these very baroque war plans. And once you do that, it's good both for your own psychology and for the credibility of the deterrent not to think too much about the sheer chaos that carrying out even the first step of these plans would entail. So that's another part of the kind of logical insanity of this. To preserve the deterrent, you don't really want to think too deeply about this. So we're all being done a grave disservice by this, obviously, in the name of as I said, of a deterrent that I think really isn't all that complicated of a matter.
This raises so many questions, but I think for me it's interesting to ask what would be worth doing all this damage for. I listened to another podcast you participated in, and it was a question between the US president and the Russian leader on if we were attacked from space.
Yes.
Would you defend me?
I go quite a lot with Ronald Reagan. Turns out to be a much more interesting character. And I was a reporter covering his presidency. Much more interesting character than I thought at the time. So, this was really the peak of the Cold War, Reagan era. And you'll recall that these Russian premiers kept dying on him. First Gorbachev, then Andropov, then Chernenko. So he finally meets with Gorbachev in 1985 in Geneva. And there was a lot of suspicion of Gorbachev at the time. I mean, he talked like a reformer, and he really wanted to change things. Most people in the US foreign policy and intelligence community didn't quite believe him initially. A lot of suspicion. So Gorbachev and Reagan meet in Geneva, and there are transcripts of all this. And their first meeting, it's very tense. And so they decide to go for a walk. They go for a walk along, this is right by the lake. They duck into a cabin where there's a fire blazing, just the two of them and their translators. And Reagan leans into Gorbachev and he says, let me ask you, if the United States was attacked by aliens from outer space, would Russia come to our defense? And Gorbachev said, absolutely. And Reagan said, I feel the same way about you. And when they walked back into the conference hall, George Shultz, the Secretary of State, wrote later in his memoir, all of a sudden the atmosphere was completely changed. They were talking and laughing like they were old friends. And then this led to the first serious arms control talks. It led to, the Reykjavik talks, which almost resulted in the abolition of all, the entire nuclear arsenals. I don't really think that would have happened, but it was aboard for a lot of reasons anyway. But this was interesting. This was the way, Reagan said this again, a UN speech a couple years later. He said, if we were attacked by aliens from outer space, the squabbles among us here on Earth would seem trivial by comparison. And his advisors tried to take out this line a couple of times because it sounds nutty, but he always kept putting it back in. That was his perspective. And it sounds a little crazy, but when you're talking about something that is so cataclysmic, maybe viewing it from 10 million miles up in the sky is the appropriate perspective. Reagan, it turns out, was secretly kind of a nuclear abolitionist. He despised nuclear. He might have been the only person who believed that Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, that it really might provide kind of a shield over the earth to knock down nuclear weapons. He was sincere when he offered to share its technology with us. He didn't understand the people who really devised this technology were intending it as something to aid and abet a first strike plan. But he was a very peculiar guy. And one of the amazing accidents in history was to have someone like him and someone like Gorbachev, who really was interested in reforming his entire system because he realized it was bankrupt and they needed to get out of the arms race so they could attract Western investment and build back their country. It's amazing that those two happened to occupy the world stage at the same time, and that's another answer to your question about the effect that a particular president might have had. Reagan signed some quite radical arms control agreements that I think kind of a moderate Democrat might not have, because it was too radical. And a more traditionally conservative Republican would not have either. So, history, there's a structure to history, but there are many contingencies brought on by random events and randomly ascendant leaders.
I wanted to ask you a bit about what you mentioned it in your introduction. What does the world look like after a nuclear war? I think you used the term nuclear winter.
Well, that's one thing that could happen.
Yeah.
Somebody in one memo many years ago talked about a smoldering radioactive ruin. I mean, again, look, we've shown how poorly prepared we were, probably us more than you, to deal with a pandemic, right? The COVID-19. It's nothing compared with what this would be. We don't have, and I don't think any other country has, the burn centers that would have to deal with burn victims. We don't, again, there isn't the kind of radioactive fallout shelters. Every kind of computer simulation of a nuclear exchange, as they call it, even a limited one, shows just catastrophic consequences to the economy, to continuity of government, to the ability to repair, rebuild. It is true that here anyway, we do have there are these alternate command centers where, say, the president and a handful of people would be swooped, inside a mountain outside in Virginia or something, where everything is all set up and they could run the government from there. There have even been some exercises of this, although not involving the real people who would be doing it. It's again, as part of the exercise of conveying a credible deterrent, we all pretend that this thing can be, brought under control, and we have this well in hand. And here's the 400-page book that outlines how we'll do this and how we'll preserve clean water and how we'll bring back such and such. But really, nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. We have not, the Blitz in London during the World War II has no comparison to what this would be like. And then, controlling the weapons that remain, making sure that somebody can't get in and launch those. It's a complete unknown. And you talk to people privately, honestly, they'll tell you this. Now, they'll also say, then again, what are we supposed to do? These weapons, they're here. They're not going away anytime soon. Are we just supposed to bury our heads in the sand and hope that nothing happens? Or do we try to prepare for something to limit the damage, to shorten the war, even if there's a very, very small probability that we're able to do it, shouldn't we at least try to do that? And, you know, some people would say, well, by putting all these things in motion, you're possibly making an actual war more likely because you're kidding yourself into thinking that this will happen. But, you know, on the other hand, you know, whether we get into a war, it might be due to actions taken by people we don't control, circumstances we can't foresee. And so, you know, there's something to their logic, which is, yeah, let's try to do something to keep this tampered down. Now, in the early stages, when people were planning for all this, they thought there was a very small chance that this could succeed. As this has become institutionalized, you know, there are now government agencies that do this. There are textbooks. There are computerized war games. It's become so much a part of the discourse. In fact, it's become more a part of the discourse than the basic concepts of this whole thing. You can easily get yourself in a situation where you're viewing this very abstractly. And what's happened, there's a tendency to forget about the underlying reality. That in fact you're, okay, go ahead and do all these things, maybe it'll do something, but don't kid yourself for a second that there's more than a single-digit percentage chance that this will all go as rationally as you believe. And there are people, you know, if this is all you do all day, who start kind of thinking that what the scenarios that they're all simulating and so forth, that this is reality, that this reflects, that the assumptions reflect some real science. You know, science is based on empirical data. There is no empirical data on any of this. So we're all kind of trapped in this logic of illusion.
So we're going to try to wrap this up, but there's a few questions from the audience that maybe you could answer. One is, could you tell us about the construction of new bombs?
Well, what has been happening recently, you know, nobody now, at least in the US nuclear decision-making circles, nobody plans on like blowing up whole cities. It's discrete targets, it's specific targets. And so they have made nuclear bombs smaller and more accurate. You know, if you have a weapon that's very accurate, say that can land within, you know, 100 feet of a target, and if you're just interested in destroying that target, it doesn't have to be, again, it's still ridiculously powerful compared with any bombs that we've ever seen gone off. But compared with, you don't need megaton bombs or even hundreds of kiloton bombs anymore. So, you know, the latest one that you might be thinking of is the so-called low-yield warhead for the Trident II submarine-launched ballistic missile, which is about 8 kilotons. But again, and you know, hey, look, would I rather have someone aim a megaton bomb at me or an 8 kiloton bomb at me? Well, if I'm within the circle, it doesn't much matter. But if I'm a few hundred miles outside that circle, it makes an enormous difference. But there is still the illusion of thinking because your weapon is small and because the particular damage that weapon does on a particular swath of territory is limited, that therefore you can limit the entire exchange of nuclear attacks that's going to go back and forth. And that's where things get dangerous.
And we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to try to be quick. There's a question, could you expand on the topic of accidents and mistakes and the probability of something like that causing a nuclear war?
Well, I'll give you 2 examples of accidents. there were a few, within a 3-month period when Jimmy Carter was president, there were 4 incidents of what seemed to be attacks. It all turned out to be a computer software problem. But one of the times, and it was it was in the middle of the night, and word got up as high as the National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and he was all set to call President Carter on the phone when it was realized that this was just it was a mistake. Nothing was going on. More seriously, around 1983 in Russia, there was one instance where it looked like 50 American nuclear weapons were headed toward Russia, 50 ICBMs. And the guy on duty that night with the Air Defense Command, this was a pretty tense moment in US-Russian relations too, but there wasn't any immediate crisis going on. And he decided, well, wait a minute, if the Americans are going to attack us, they're not going to attack us with 50 weapons. They're going to use all their ICBMs. We had 1,000 ICBMs at the time. So I'm going to say this isn't really happening, and I'm not going to tell the guys upstairs. If you told the guys upstairs, they might have responded. I mean, look, around this same time, you might recall Korean Airlines Flight 7 intruded into Russian airspace by accident. From one angle, the profile of the plane looked like a spy plane. There had been an American spy plane over that part of Russia earlier that night, as we learned much later. Now, even so, that should have been no reason to shoot the plane down. But these guys, if these guys had been on duty that night, instead of the guy who was, he might have sent it up and all hell might have broken loose. There's a scholar named Scott Sagan at Stanford University who wrote an entire book about near misses and false warnings. They happen, and there's no reason why they couldn't happen again.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left. So looking forward, you have an election coming up in November.
Mm-hmm.
There's 2 candidates. Would there be any difference in concern to nuclear war, whether Biden or Trump won the election in November?
I think there's a concern about everything. In terms of nuclear war, I mean, as I said, one thing that we have learned in this administration is that Trump does not seem as eager to go to war as we've thought. But he does talk very loud. He gets himself into crises that luckily, and then sometimes it's just been luckily, have died down before they've swelled. But I think he's also someone who would do almost anything to stay in power and has no respect for his own military and intelligence officials, who thinks that he's smarter than everybody else. One of maybe the most dangerous person around, it would be someone who thinks that he knows a lot, in fact knows almost nothing, and is in a position of real power. And so, I'm very uncomfortable when someone like Kim Jong-un has nuclear weapons under his belt. And I'm not saying that Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump are 2 very different people in many ways, but I don't like the idea of anybody who has any kind of irrational element in them having anything to do with nuclear weapons, or any particularly self-centered or narcissistic view of the world to have control over these kinds of things. It's bad enough when somebody really smart has control over them. Things still get out of hand.
I think we have to end on that note. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and your knowledge. And for the listeners or viewers, if you have any questions, you can send them to post@nei-til-atomvåpen.org. And thank you so much for your time, Fred.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.